Nesachim ksherim. The libations were valid, but a zevach pasul. But there was something wrong with the actual animal sacrifice. Vafilu zevazeh psulim. Or even if each of them are pasul, both of them are pasul.
What does he use? Makel?
We didn't get to his rule yet. The rule is going to be hazevach layered v'nesachim yerdu. The animal stays on the altar, but the nesachim come off. You just want to point out that it doesn't mean that you actually sprinkled it or poured it and you're going to walk up there with a towel and wipe it down. It's talking about that if the kohen went up on the altar with in his hand in a jug or whatever, you say no, it's invalid. He comes down. He comes off the altar for the nesachim. If it would be for the animal, he won't do that. If we're talking about things that are eligible to go on the altar, and we said that there's a machlekes about things that are burnt, that are not burnt. For example, the libations or the blood. Royal in. What's eligible to go on the altar? Yes. In is a difficult word for young yeshiva students, because in Hebrew the way it's read is ein. Ein means not. In Aramaic, in means yes. So it's very confusing.
Tricky.
It's very confusing. I mean, you can see it very often in context, but it's
confusing because there's Hebrew and Aramaic in the Gemara.
Right.
Right.
You see, there's another word, hain. Hain means yes, with a hey. But there's there's changes of letters over time and through when it switches languages, and it turned into ain, which ain in Hebrew means no. So hain, which is yes, turned into in Old English, he means the male, third person he. I think in Old English, if it was a female, it was hey or something. He, there was a difference in two. We used to have two types of yous, you, yay, or something. We used to have ye. We have ye or something.
Yeah.
So,
thou.
Thou. But at a certain
That's
point,
like
it was
Old
so
English with an E.
confusing.
Old with an E. Old
Old
English.
but at a certain point, they put an S by the she to make it she. I don't know if that was on purpose or if there was another language that blended into it. But now it's easier for us. Anyway, this is difficult. So royalai in. What's worthy to go on the mizbeach? Yes. She'ein royalai, but it's not eligible or not worthy to go on the mizbeach. Loi does not stay on the mizbeach. It's meant to come down. Lemute mai. What are you coming to exclude? What would be something that you would need to take down? Amarav Papa lemute kamatzim shleikit shebekeli. We're talking about if someone had a meal offering. The kohen gadol, the kohen sticks his 3 fingers into the flour, and he does. It's called kmitza. He holds it in his hand, and he's supposed to put it into a vessel, a holy vessel, and that's like sanctifies it, especially that it's going to be burned. So he did kmitza, but he didn't put it into the vessel. So before he puts it into the vessel, it's not eligible to go on the altar. It didn't have that second sanctity. So Maskefla Ravina asks a question. Maishna midu why is this different from Ula? What Ula said. Ula was one of the sages. He used to travel back and forth from Israel. Damar Ula, that Ula said, Imuri kachim kalim shehelan lefnei zrikas daman la yerdu. See, when it comes to kachim kalim, there's two types of the sacrifice can be divided into 2 categories: kachim and kachim kalim, very holy and secondary holiness. Of secondary holiness, if someone has benefit from the sacrifice before the blood is sprinkled, it doesn't violate me'ila. Me'ila is having benefit from something that's sanctified. It's of secondary holiness. But once the blood is sprinkled, then the limbs get the status of being holy, and if you have personal benefit from it, it's a violation of me'ila. So let's say a muri kachim kalim. These are the limbs of a kachi kalim sacrifice, that you bring them on the altar before the blood was sprinkled. So they don't have the right
So chronologically, they're messed up.
Yeah, they don't have the right holiness yet because the blood wasn't sprinkled. They haven't been raised up to the level of holiness that they're eligible to go on the altar, because the blood they're supposed to be run on the altar after the blood was sprinkled. He brought them up before the blood was sprinkled. So Ula says la yerdu, nasalach mishal mizbeach. They become the food of the altar. What does that expression mean? It means that the mizbeach sanctifies it. Now we can understand from Ula that even though it wasn't eligible to go on the altar yet, the altar still keeps it, and it doesn't. You don't take it down. So what's the difference between the kmitza, which we just said that if you bring it up on the altar, you're going to have to take it down because it wasn't put in a vessel yet. Putting it into a vessel is very similar to the oila, to the sacrifice, to the limbs of the sacrifice, that the blood wasn't sprinkled. It wasn't brought up.
One
to
is
the
kmitza, and one is. How do you compare kmitza to karbonos?
I'll tell you. The comparison is this: it's not at the level of holiness yet that it should be brought on the altar. Kmitza needs to be put into a vessel,
right?
And
in order for it to be holy,
right, before it's put on the altar.
Right.
Kachim kalim, the blood needs to be sprinkled for it to reach a level of holiness that it's then put on the altar.
So they're both kind of in limbo.
So they're both not yet ready to be burnt, to be put on the altar.
Okay.
So they're missing something. They're not yet eligible to be put on. So Ula says that if it's put on the altar, the limbs are put on the altar before the blood was sprinkled, you leave it there. Our Gemara says that the kmitza, if it's put on the altar before it's put into the vessel, you take it down. Ravina says, what's the difference? So the Gemara answers, Hanach le'mechzer ma'aser b'gufayo, ani mechzer ma'aser b'gufayo. The difference is that one of them is lacking something in itself. The kmitza needed to be put into the vessel. It itself is missing something by the sacrifice, that the limbs were not eligible to go on. It's because the blood wasn't sprinkled. That's not an intrinsic issue on itself. This itself is ready. You just needed to do some other thing with the blood. But here, the kmitza, there's an intrinsic problem. You didn't put this itself. This itself was missing the vessel.
The oila is like it's rui. So
the oila is considered
it's good,
right.
Even though the blood
Right.
you didn't do it exactly right. Whereas
here, this itself is missing. Rabbi Shua says anything that's eligible for the fire. Ram Gamliel said anything that's eligible to go on the altar doesn't come down. Okay, Ram Gamliel nami aksiv oila al maikter. For Ram Gamliel, it also says that oila that goes on the fire. We're going to go back and forth here. How do they learn it? According to each one, you say this verse. What does he do with that verse? Very typical the way the Gemara uses the verses, which tries to satisfy both opinions. How they can learn to have two different opinions using the same verses. What does Ram Gamliel do? It says that it goes on the fire. It says ahula duri paikinuda. So that's coming to teach me something else. When you burn something, so if there's liquid inside, Rashi brings this, so it could jump because the gases get caught inside, and it could like pop off the altar. That's the way Rashi writes this. So as it's being burnt, so if it pops off from so you have to put it back on. That's what Rabbi Gamliel says. This is what I learned from that on the fire. On the fire means you have to put it back, return it back on. V'idach. What does Rabbi Yeshua? How does Rabbi Yeshua say no that you have to put it back on? La duri paikin minale. Where does he know that from? Nafklei masher toichaleish. It says what the fire consumes. It means you have to put it back on if it's not consumed yet. V'idach. What does Ram Gamliel do with asher toichaleish that the fire consumes? The fire consumes is coming to tell me that only if something of the sacrifice jumps off, pops off the altar, you have to put it back on. But if ketores pops off, you don't have to put that back on. The incense pops off. The Tani Reb Chanina bar Minyumi. What is this note here? B'debei Rabbi Eliezer, Reb Chanina bar Minyumi says, from the house of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, from Yeshiva Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. I'm not familiar with that expression, from the house of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. There's popular yeshivas, and said the Beir Rabbi Shmuel, the Beir Rabbi Yanai, and this is like a new one. So, from the house of Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, it says clearly, it was said in the yeshiva of Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov that you don't return onto the altar what's not consumed from the ketores if it jumps off. V'idach, what does the other opinion do, Rabbi Gamliel? The idach is, we're back to Rabbi Gamliel here, or we're just explaining Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua, we're on Rabbi Yeshua now. We asked, how does Rabbi Gamliel know? What does Rabbi Gamliel do with Asher Teichal Leish, that the fire consumes? We said the fire consumes tells me that you have to return the oila onto the altar, but not the ketores. Now, what does Rabbi Yeshua? How does Rabbi Yeshua know that what jumps off the altar from the fire, that it pops off, that you return, but you don't return the what jumps off from the ketores? That we know automatically. What the Gemara is saying here is that certain things, you can use one verse to teach me two things. How do you do that? One, if one of them is just in the literal meaning of the verse, and another one is I'm getting from the extra language, or if it's, but over here what Rabbi Yeshua is saying is that I can get both. I can understand that it needs to be consumed by the fire, so I'd have to put it back on from the Eilash Teichalesh that it's consumed, and I'm also going to learn from that that you don't have to return the ketores. That I'm also going to learn that
from which is he learning both things?
He's learning from Asher Teichal Eish, that the fire consumes.
So he's learning, okay.
It says, "Behirim esadeshen Asher Teichal Eish esa oila ala mizbeach." What the fire consumed from the oila. That's what this is talking about, taking the ashes off the altar. Okay, so Rabbi Shua uses it for two things. One, that you have to put it back on, and that you don't put back on the ketores. Rabbi Gamliel says anything that's worthy to be put on the altar doesn't come down, as opposed to Rabbi Shua that said anything that's worthy to be put on the fire. Rabbi Shua nami yaksiv mizbeach. It says mizbeach. What does Rabbi Shua do with Rabbi Gamliel's verse? Rabbi Gamliel is saying, it says that if it's put on the altar, so why do you have to mix in the fire? It says altar. Anything that's eligible to go on the altar, which would include also the libations and the blood. So Rabbi Yeshua uses that verse, Umi Baile. That verse is needed. Maika Amar Rachmana. What is God saying? What is the Torah saying? Kol Arei L'Maikta Mekadosh Mizbeach. Anything that's worthy to be burnt, even though it's a sacrifice, but it gains a certain sanctity by being put on the altar. The altar sanctifies it. It's, in other words, the reason why it's not coming off is not the sacrifice aspect of it, it's the altar that's giving it that extra status, that extra holiness. V'idach, so what does Rabbi Gamliel know from the word Mizbeach? How does he know that Mizbeach is telling me that it's the Mizbeach that holds it on there? Mizbeach Achrin Eksiv, it says twice in the pasuk Mizbeach. V'idach, what does Rabbi Shua do? It says twice Mizbeach. Chad lehechad dehaisele shasa kosher, v'chad lehechad leisele shasa kosher. There's two types of problems with sacrifices. One type of sacrifice that never was eligible, with the way it was born or whatever. And the other one is that it was eligible, but it had a problem later. So I need two mizbeachs to tell me that it stays on the altar. V'idach, what does Rabbi Gamliel do? How does he know that both types of problems stay on the altar? Given the Peslun in Rabbi Rahman, Rabbi Gamliel doesn't make that distinction. I don't care if it was born like that or came later like that. The fact is that if it goes on the altar, it's allowed to remain on the altar. Rabbi Shua says, no, I could have thought maybe only one of them, so I need 2 verses that say on the altar to know that it stays there. Rabbi Shimon Aimer, Zevach Kasher, Rabbi Shimon had a very interesting opinion. Rabbi Shimon says that anything that's brought on the altar, if an animal is brought together with its libations, usually a sacrifice was brought on the altar, together with each type of animal, you had to bring a certain amount of flour and oil and wine. Rabbi Shimon says that the animal you don't take down off the altar if it was no good. You don't remove an animal, but you do remove the libations.
What if the libations were good and the animal's no good? Libations are fine.
Then you would leave it on.
Wait, Rabbi Shimon holds again. He says, you leave. You would
actually take it off. I think the libations would come off in that instance. Also, we'll see in the Gemara. Tanya was taught in the Brisa. Reb Shimon Aimer. Oila. Reb Shimon says Oila. Ma Oila haba beglalatzmai af kol habayim beglalatzmai yosin nosachim habayim beglal zevach. The only thing that's allowed to stay on the altar are things that were meant to be there because of their own holiness, because of themselves. They come on their own. But anything that comes as a secondary to something else, for example, the libations that come along with the sacrifice, anything that comes along, that does not stay on the altar. He learns it because it says in the verse, a burnt offering comes on its own. It's not a secondary to some other offering. So only a burnt offering is what stays on the altar. Excuse me.
But the libations or whatever.
Libations are secondary, so they come off the altar.
Despite the fact that they were done correctly.
If the sacrifice was not correct. Okay. This is actually a new brisa. Let's see if we can get through this quickly. Rabbi Yosef Glili says, because it says in the verse, Kol HaMizbeach Yikdash, anything that touches the altar is sanctified. Sheme'ani, I understand, Bein Roi, Bein Shein Roi, whether it was worthy to be on the altar, whether not. Talmud Laimar, therefore the verse tells me, Kvasim, sheep, Ma Kvasim Ru'im, just like sheep are worthy to go on the altar. Af Kol Roi, also anything that's worthy to go on the altar. Rabbi Kiva says, Oila. It says in the verse, Oila, Ma Oila Haruya Af Kol Roi. Anything, just like an Oila is worthy to go on the altar, also anything that's worthy. The Gemara asks, My Benayo. You just said two opinions here. Each of them said anything that's worthy to go on the altar. One learned it from sheep, one learned it from Oila, but it's the same thing. What's the difference? Amar Ravada Barava. Ravada Barava explains, Oila Saif Psule Benayo. An Oila that's a bird offering Oila is the difference between them. Mar Maisalam Oila. One of them learned from the word Oila. Mar Maisalam Kvasim, and one learned it from sheep. So if you learn it from Oila, this is also an Oila. But if you learn it from sheep, so only animals, but not birds. Birds would come down. The one that learns it from the sheep, I Haksiv Oila. What does he do with the word Oila? So Iksiv Kvasim, if it would only say sheep, but it didn't say Oila, I would have thought even if you bring a live animal out to the altar, you don't take it down. Because of Rahman Oila, it tells me a burnt offering that a live animal does come off the altar. The one that learns it from Oila, Haksiv Kvasim, says sheep. What does he do with the word sheep? Teach me that not birds. Iksiv Oila, if it would say Oila, burnt offering, but it didn't say sheep. I would have thought even a meal offering. Kasser Rachmana Kvasim comes to teach me, the Torah teaches me sheep, not meal offerings. What's the difference between this brisa that says Oila or Kvasim to the two opinions that we have in the Mishnah, which is Rabbi Shua and Rabbi Gamliel, which say burnt on the altar or just eligible for the altar? What's the difference between these two and those two? Papa if you did kmitza and you put it into a vessel, latana didan la yerdu, if it's a carbon mincha, according to our Mishnah, if it was put into a vessel, it's eligible to stay on the altar. But according to these Tanaim, Tani de Masnisa, Yerdu, you take it off the altar. Okay. Why do you take it off the altar? Because they say it's only animal offerings. Oila or kvasim, burnt offerings, or sheep, but not a carbon mincha. Carbon mincha that's brought on the altar, even if it was totally eligible, but there was something wrong with it, some sort of...
This is the second opinion.
You don't take it, you according to the Brisa, you take it off the altar. According to the Mishnah, you would leave it on the altar. Okay.
8 o'clock tomorrow?
Yeah, 8 o'clock.